I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Orlaigh Byrne to the stage, who will be presenting on Breaking Barriers, the Experience of Autistic Therapists. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, and thank you for those who stayed. I have complete imposter syndrome after listening to all the presentations today. I just want to present my research on breaking barriers, the experience of autistic therapists. And I chose this title of Breaking Barriers because I felt there's a breaking of barriers from two perspectives. That the barriers that autistic clients face when trying to access and engage in therapy, but also the barriers that autistic professionals face in their day-to-day lives. So I'm going to start by just having a look at the background research in relation to autistic clients in therapy and see what that research led us to, and then have a look at what I did in my research and the method I used to carry out the research. And then I'll quickly talk about my findings and show you a few quotes from the participants and discuss the implications of those findings for, I suppose, for neurotypical therapists, more so than neurodivergent therapists, but also for future research. So, why this research subject? It's widely known, and we've heard it so much over the last 3 days, that mental health conditions are mental health difficulties are disproportionately high among the autistic population, and yet the number of autistic clients accessing therapy is disproportionately lower. And I started to wonder why that was, and I looked into the different research. And a lot of it came from the incongruence that exists between society, the society that we live in, and autistic people. One of my research participants actually said, I'm living in a world that's inherently traumatic for me. And as a post-primary teacher and as a psychotherapist who works mainly with neurodivergent young people, I've really carried that with me since that. What's it like to live in a world that's inherently traumatic for you? There was lots of research from the autistic client's perspective, but I was really surprised at the lack of research from the autistic therapist's perspective. And I really felt that here's the real experts in the area, someone who's experienced a diagnosis of autism, someone who's experienced being a therapist, but has also experienced therapy, maybe at some other stage in their lives, but definitely through their therapy training. So, the research showed, I'd better click on here as well, I have two in front of me. The research showed that there are many barriers for autistic clients when they seek to access and engage in therapy. And the largest, I suppose, barrier was communication challenges. So communication challenges existed before, during, and after therapy. So what were the communication challenges before therapy? How do you access therapy? Do you make a phone call? Do you have to fill in a complicated intake form where the language might be vague? Do you send an email? Do you need to actually go in person to person? And straight away, this can mean that autistic clients didn't access therapy. Within the therapy room, then, communication challenges existed in the practicalities. How am I expected to communicate? Can I pace around the room? Do I need to sit face to face in a chair and talk to somebody for an hour? Can I self-regulate? Can I sit on the floor if I want to sit on the floor? And it wasn't the expectations of the therapist, but it was actually the vagueness and the fact that clients didn't know what to expect. So when it was vague and when there was no clear boundaries, it created an immediate barrier to the client accessing that therapy. Other barriers were where, and this really came true, and it was really heartbreaking, the research, clients felt ignored, they felt stigmatized, they felt discriminated against, they felt misunderstood, and they felt that the therapist didn't validate their reality and their experience. There was also research that showed there was a lack of willingness or lack of effort on the part of therapists to adapt their therapy to meet the needs of their autistic client. And the last thing was the lack of education or training around therapy, around autistic clients in therapy. And actually, some clients reported that they made the move to actually engage in therapy only to find they were being referred on because the therapist felt that they didn't have the confidence or competence to work with an autistic person. There is the good news. There was facilitators to therapy, where there was clear, explicit boundaries around communication, where people knew what to expect when they were going into therapy, where the therapist could be flexible in relation to communication, but was clear about their boundaries, communication outside of therapy, and how to communicate. If the therapist had engaged in training, preferably training devised and delivered by autistic people, but definitely training that came from a neuroaffirmative perspective and not from a social deficit model or an outdated medical model. Where a therapist actually made the effort to tailor their therapy to meet the needs of their client, or where they accommodated individual needs, particularly sensory. Therapy offices, as a therapist, I'm great for a scented candle. The scented candles are great, and they usually have to leave the room when certain clients come in, and it's those sensory issues, the lighting, the temperature, the noises outside or inside the room. If a therapist is showing that they're making an effort to accommodate individual needs, then it's creating therapeutic alliance, and it's building an effective therapeutic alliance. After looking at all that research, I had so many questions. So I knew I just needed to really narrow it down, and these are the three main aims of my research. I wanted to really explore the lived experience of an autistic therapist, what it was like for them to be autistic, what it was like to be a therapist, and what it was like to be an autistic therapist. I wanted to look at their understanding of autism-informed therapy and to see what's our vision, what's the best practice, what is their goal, and what should we strive for to support autistic clients in therapy. And finally, because it had been such a big part in the research literature I had looked up, I wanted to look at communication issues and to see what autistic therapists felt communication issues were in therapy and how we could overcome or how we could address these issues. And I had a lot of discussion around Damien Milton's double empathy theory, and I've heard it a lot here today as well. That's what came up there. My study design was interviews with 5 Irish autistic therapists, and it gave such rich, meaningful data. It was such an interesting experience for me. I was really, really conscious, and I've seen it out on posters as I went around today, conscious of cultural humility. I was conscious of being really respectful to the autistic experience, and I was conscious of my responsibility of portraying the autistic voice. Once I had gathered my data, I used IPA to analyse it, and the reason I chose IPA was it's really rooted in the unique setting of a person, and I suppose the uniqueness, it respects the uniqueness, and every therapist, autistic or non-autistic, has a unique setting and a unique story to tell. But it also has a focus on researcher reflexivity. And like I say, that was really important to me, that I was constantly checking myself to make sure that I was respectful of phenomenological diversity. This is what my brain looked like for about 3 weeks after I had gathered all the information and transcribed interviews, but it did actually tidy itself up after a while. The 3 themes we looked at, 2 of which had already come from the research, was knowledge of autism, autistic identity, and autism in the therapy room. So, knowledge of autism, sorry, I didn't move that on actually. Knowledge of autism looked at neurodiversity, and the participants, the autistic therapists, felt that neurodiversity, while it's a really positive and it's a very empowering movement, they questioned the need for it at all, that diversity is just a feature of evolution, as you can see here, and why do we need a neurodiversity movement? They questioned whether neurodiversity movement, while it's good in theory, has it made any real changes in practice? Our participants expressed huge frustration in relation to education and a lack of education on the part of neurotypical therapists. And one gave a very stark image of 2 bookshelves in her office. One was a bookshelf with books about autism, where counselling and therapy was mentioned a lot, and the other was a bookshelf about counselling and therapy where autism didn't feature at all. The second theme was in relation to autistic identity, and this is where the really, I suppose, unique aspect of my research came from. Participants shared experience of diagnosis from a social deficit and an outdated medical model, and highlighted the importance for therapists to understand that diagnosis needs to be viewed as Amy Pearson said earlier, as neutral. It's not a superpower, but actually it's not a deficit, and therapists need to be really aware of that. Therapists also need to be aware of masking and the role that masking can play. And we had long discussions about unmasking in therapy and how much of a complex, painful process that can be. And the final theme was autism in the therapy room. And I don't need to go into Damien Milton's double empathy theory. That's what the communication issues really centred around. And acceptance was vital. Acceptance in the communication, in the therapy room was deemed vital. Validation of the autistic experience and accepting, and I suppose really building up that alliance and the relief of finding somebody who accepts you as you are. And just to note that the autistic therapists really highlighted how we can cause harm as therapists if we don't understand autism. The discussion is just a highlight of the three themes that I've just mentioned, so I'm just going to skip on to the implications for future practice. So the implications for future practice would be, it would be great to have a neurodivergence competency. My association has standards for working with under 18s. I'd love if we had standards for working with autistic clients. Just to drop assumptions and respect autistic culture, value difference, and really embrace that within the therapy room where we can learn from each other. And that therapy training should definitely include neurodiversity modules. Space framework, Mary Doherty, Sebastian Shaw and Sue McCann's space framework, I think is like the cheat sheet for therapists, and it's a poster that's in my office all the time. And if we can incorporate that into all therapists' office, I think we'd go a long way towards meeting the needs. I really feel that, yes, it can be a little bit more complex, but actually, like Peter Vermeulen and Wen Lawson said this morning, if we work together, we can be a great team. And I do think if we work together, we can break down barriers for autistic people seeking therapy. Thanks a million.